Welcome. A chess game usually consists of three phases. We refer to these phases as the opening, the middle game, and the ending or endgame. When starting a game of chess, the initial moves are referred to as the opening. The phase referred to as the middle game is generally considered to begin after each player has completed the development of all or most of their pieces and they've brought their king to some relatively safe position. There's no precise point at which we can say that the opening is completed and the middle game begins. Likewise, there's no precise point at which we can say we're exiting the middle game and entering the end game. Although there are very many ways to play the first few moves of a game, the opening, they're all based on some general rules. So in this video, we'll explain these general rules and provide some examples from common opening lines. So let's get started. Very concisely, we can say that the practical rules which govern play in the opening can be summarized as follows. Control the center, preferably by occupying it with pawns. Develop pieces by bringing them from their starting position onto squares from which they can influence the action of the game, in particular where they have an influence on the center that you're trying to control. But some of the pieces will go beyond that. Castle, to place the king in a safe position and bring the rook into the center. Now, when developing the pieces, we generally start with the king side pieces to allow the king to move to a safer area by castling. Remember that between the king and its rook, we have only a knight and a bishop, while between the king and the queen's rook, we have the queen, a knight, and a bishop. This is why we say generally we'll consider the king side pieces. Now, these general principles are not hard and fast rules. However, by adhering to these principles, a player's pieces will be prepared for the next phase of the game, that is, for the middle game. Now, from these general rules, we can determine two fundamental concepts: develop the pieces and seek control of the center. And of course, that raises the question now of what do we mean by the center? Well, the center consists of four squares in the geometrical center of the board. These would be the squares E4, D4, E5, and D5. Now, by controlling these squares, one side can divide the enemy forces, similar to the idea of driving a wedge into a log, causing the log to split into two pieces. So this is why we strive to control the center in the beginning of the game. Reuben Fine was an American chess grandmaster and a psychologist. He was active in the 1930s and the 1940s, and a little beyond that. He was actually a candidate for the World Championship, competing in competitions among the strongest players in the world. He authored a book called The Ideas Behind the Chess Openings, and within this book he offered 10 practical principles or rules, kind of expanding upon what we've just mentioned. He suggested that control the center by doing what? Opening the game with the E-pawn or the D-pawn, placing a pawn on one of those squares. Whenever possible, make a good developing move, which threatens something. Develop knights before bishops. Now again, even the rules presented here by Reuben Fine are not hard and fast rules, but these general principles you'll see appearing in many of the common openings, and it's a good way to get your feet wet and get started with the game. Number 4 was to pick the most suitable square for a piece and develop it there once and for all. What does that mean? Don't move the same piece repeatedly in the opening. Remember, you have an army of forces. Don't just get one soldier out there. Get them all on the playing field. Make 1 or 2 pawn moves in the opening. Generally, that's sufficient. Don't want to make more than that. So Reuben Fine had 10 principles. We've just seen 5. Here are the other 5. Don't bring out the queen too early. Castle as soon as possible, again preferably on the king's side for the reason we mentioned a few moments ago. Play to get control of the center. Always try to maintain at least 1 pawn in the center. We want an influence by having a presence in the center, and that pawn exerts further influence because of its ability to capture diagonally. Don't sacrifice without a clear and adequate reason. Now, in addition to the expanded list of opening principles, Fine adds that 2 questions should be answered for each move that you play, or each move that your opponent plays. How does the move affect the center? How does the move fit in with the development of other pieces and pawns? We'll now consider a series of opening moves that follows the principles we've presented. The moves shown here define a collection of moves called the Ruy Lopez, or Spanish opening. These moves were published in a chess book in 1561 by the Spanish cleric Ruy Lopez de Segura. Note that when recording the moves of the game, the moves are numbered starting at 1. White moves first, so the move made by white, in this case e4, is recorded first, and then the move made by black for move number 1, e5, appears next. With these first moves by white and black, each player has advanced a pawn 2 squares. Now the advanced pawn occupies one of the center squares. This follows our opening principle number 1. Now, why is this principle important? Well, the white pawn on e4 attacks the squares that are diagonally in front of it. This pawn is attacking d5 and f5. The black pawn on e5 is attacking similar squares, namely d4 and f4. Squares attacked by pawns discourage the other player from placing a piece on these squares. Now, another important point about these pawn moves is that the king's bishop is no longer completely blocked. It now has an option of moving from its starting square. The white king's bishop now has available all of the squares on the f1 to a6 diagonal. Furthermore, both queens are now available to move. Playing a move such as e4 opens lines for other pieces to move, so this follows opening principle number 2. The next move by white is quite logical. White does not like the fact that black pawn is attacking 2 squares in white's territory. Therefore, white attacks the black pawn and at the same time develops a piece, again looking at opening principle number 2. Black must respond to the attack against his pawn. Thus, black plays a move to defend his pawn and likewise develops a piece. Now both white and black are following the basic opening principles that we've identified. Each side is developing pieces and pawns in an attempt to control the center squares. Now let's consider another idea. Suppose that black did not play the knight to c6, but instead chose to play the bishop to d6. On the d6 square, the bishop would protect the pawn on e5. This move would also develop another piece. However, playing b6 is actually a bad move. Now, what is bad about it? Well, by positioning the bishop on d6, the d7 pawn cannot advance. And if that cannot advance, then there's much less capability for the black queen, and furthermore, the black queen bishop is restricted to its original square. Okay, returning to our earlier position, where both sides have advanced their e-pawns 2 squares, and each side has developed a knight, the next move by white is a logical continuation of the objective of trying to control the center. White realizes that if he can attack and threaten to capture the black knight on c6, the black pawn on e5 would no longer be protected. So, how would white go about performing this type of an attack? Well, the answer is play the bishop to b5. With this bishop, white attacks the black knight that's defending the pawn on e5. It's this third move by white that defines the opening, named Ruy Lopez. So black responds by threatening the white bishop. How does he do that? He plays the pawn to a6. This move is actually called the Morphy variation, named after Paul Morphy, a young man from New Orleans who was considered the unofficial world champion back in 1857. After the pawn moves to a6, the bishop now has a choice. It can retreat while still attacking the black knight by moving to a4, or it can capture the black knight. Let's consider the retreat to a4. So he plays bishop to a4. Bishop is no longer attacked, but there's still a threat on the black knight. So black responds by developing another piece and attacking white's pawn on e4, playing knight to f6. So the moves we've seen logically relate to one another. Both sides are trying to seek a better position from which to continue the game. That is, both sides are trying to obtain some kind of an advantage from these initial opening moves. So the following moves continue with a logical approach to start the game. White will castle. Black plays bishop to c5, developing another piece and preparing to castle himself. White plays c3, black plays b5, attacking the bishop. The bishop retreats now to c2, and black continues with d6. From this position, black will soon castle and complete development by moving the final piece, the bishop on c8,
White will continue to advance the d pawn, or will try to advance the d pawn to the d4 square to open the c1 h6 diagonal for white's queen bishop. So again, there's a logical sequence of moves being made here. We had indicated that after black plays a6 and attacks the bishop is given two choices. Let's consider the other choice of the bishop, to capture the knight on c6. This move enters a variation of the Ruy Lopez called the exchange variation. Although white is willing to exchange a bishop for the knight that is defending the pawn in e5, this doesn't mean that white is going to win the pawn. Question is, if he plays knight x e5, why doesn't this win the pawn? Black has a very good response. The answer lies in recognizing that both the knight, now sitting on e5, and the white pawn on e4 are not defended. It's possible to attack both the knight and the pawn at the same time. Black would then recover the pawn that white has just captured. The rationale lies in the fact that clearly if both a knight and a pawn are being attacked, it'd be wise to save the knight and give up the pawn. Thus, if black can attack both pieces, the knight would move away to a safe square, and black would be free to capture the pawn in e4. This capture would restore the balance. What's the move? Well, black would take his queen and move it up to d4. Remember, d4 would be attacking e5, where the white knight would be situated, and e4, where the white pawn is situated. In the previous display, we assumed that black was capturing the bishop with the d-pawn. However, we should be aware that after white captures on c6, black has two ways to capture the bishop. He can capture with the d-pawn or with the b-pawn. If black captures with the b-pawn, the pawn on a6 becomes isolated. What does that mean? Well, the picture pretty much tells the story. This pawn is all by itself. There are no other pawns near it. And the consequence of an isolated pawn would be that if that pawn became attacked, it would have to be defended with pieces. There are no pawns nearby that can defend it. So the pieces that protect the isolated pawn would not be available for other activities. So an isolated pawn is considered a weakness, and in general, such weaknesses should be avoided. Now, by capturing with the d-pawn, black avoids getting an isolated pawn. We then continue play with white proceeding to castle kingside, but then black is faced with the problem that because its queen knight has been removed, its e-pawn, its pawn on e5, is now unprotected. So therefore, black has to take some action to protect this pawn, and the action would amount to playing the pawn from f7 to f6. White can then continue by playing the queen pawn to d4, and black would proceed to make a move such as bishop to g4. Now let's discuss the rationale behind bishop to g4. White has just played this pawn to d4, which is attacking the e5 pawn. If black were to take, white can then take with the knight. To prevent that recapture with the knight, black plays his bishop up here to g4, and this knight is now said to be pinned. What that means is if the knight were to move, something in the line of attack of the bishop, in this case the queen on d1, would be subject to capture. Therefore, we don't want to move the knight, because if we move the knight, the bishop could take the queen, a much more powerful piece. So the concept of a pin involves preventing, or at least discouraging, a piece from moving, because if that piece moved, in this case the white knight, another piece would be attacked. So by moving the bishop to g4, black creates a pin. The knight is prevented from moving. With the white knight pinned, how might white continue? Well, white could proceed to take his d-pawn and capture on e5. Notice that that would open the d-file, in which case black may very well play queen takes queen. White would then respond with rook takes queen, and then the f-pawn could capture the white pawn. Now, question is, if this is the position we reach, what happens if white proceeds to take his knight and captures this unprotected pawn on e5? Even though we don't have the queen here, we still do have an unprotected piece. If the knight moved, the bishop would come down and capture the rook. Well, with what we've presented here, we've given you a taste of opening principles, and we showed how these could be applied in one of the best-known opening systems, the Ruy Lopez. There are many other lines possible in this opening, but this gives you a feel for how the principles can be used to develop your pieces and prepare for the middle game. Let's take a look at one more opening. Here's another popular opening, and this also is an older opening. Rather than play the individual moves, I'll simply list them here and give you the position that we arrive at. This is an opening called the Gioco Piano, or also called the Italian game. You can see that by making these 6 moves, the pieces are focusing on the center, and we have several pieces developed. Both sides have castled. So again, by playing these moves, both sides have adhered to the opening principles we've talked about, and they're ready to proceed with the middle game. Let's see what we've covered in this video. We've talked about the practical rules or principles of opening play. We identified 2 general concepts: the idea of developing the pieces and controlling the center of the board. We looked at a classic opening to illustrate the principles. We looked at the Ruy Lopez. We also introduced 2 other concepts that often occur in the game: an isolated pawn, which we said is generally an undesirable weakness, and the pinning of a piece. Well, much more can be said about chess openings in general. However, I hope that you now have an idea of what should be considered in playing the opening phase of the game. By remembering the general principles or rules presented in this video, you should be on your way to achieving a good position and prepared to play the middle game. So until next time.